Welcome back for day 2 of the Ginger Sew Along. We're going to jump right in and continue with step 12. Step 12 is a buttonhole. It's the horizontal buttonhole that is at the top at the neck. And the reason we need to go ahead and put that in now is because later you will have a bias band and a ruffle that will actually come down over top of it. And it makes it very hard, almost impossible to put a buttonhole in at that point. So we're going to go ahead and do that first buttonhole. And along with that, get your piece that is your neck ruffle and don't press it, but just fold it in half and stitch across each end. Just there, and at the other end, trim it, flip it, then press it in half with the right sides out. After you've done that, go ahead and put your gathering threads on the raw edge side of the ruffle with it folded. And then we'll be back. Now we're ready to gather the ruffle and pin it in place. Your instructions don't say this, but I went ahead and basted the lining and the fabric together. We're going to treat it as one, and that way, as we're pinning it, it won't shift. So on the right-hand side of your bodice, where you just put your buttonhole, you're going to place the ruffle so that it is right there at the edge of the bodice. And then you'll continue pinning, distributing your ruffles as you go, your gathers. And then when you get to the left-hand side of the bodice, that's when you will place the end of the ruffle on that line that you marked that was on your pattern piece. It was actually on your bodice piece. So after you've gotten your gathers distributed and pinned in place, stitch this down using a 1/4 inch seam. And then we will be back for the bias band. Okay, now that you've got your ruffle on, go back and just clean up the seam allowance. I don't actually trim it as much as I just kind of clean it up, because you want that 1/4 inch seam allowance. That's what fills in that space of the bias band we're going to be putting on and keeps the bias band from looking twisted if it's got all of the seam allowance filling it up. So if that makes sense. So once you've cleaned up that edge a little bit, then you need to take your bias band and press a 1/4 inch to the wrong side along one long edge. And then when you stitch the bias band on, you'll be stitching raw edges together. And then I was going to move on to step 16 and show you how to do that, because I think it's confusing sometimes. And then actually this is just basted on because I want to show you another way that we can put the bias band on. So first, after you've got it stitched on and that 1/4 inch, trim to a 1/4 inch there on the end, press the bias band away from your dress. Then what they're telling you to do in number 16 is to take that folded edge and fold it so that it meets where the bias band attaches to the dress. So you're going to fold it over. This is why it's really important to stitch this on with a 1/4 inch, press the edge a 1/4 inch, and because there's really not much room for error here. So once it's on, pressed back like that, I'm going to put a pin here and just take a couple of stitches. So what I'm doing is I'm just stitching right across here, right alongside the edge of the bodice, but just right there. So if you've got 1/4 inch sticking out here, then that's 1/4 inch seam. So let me stitch that just real quick. Okay, so I just basted it because I'm going to take this off in a second. So then you would trim that little 1/4 inch down to 1/8 of an inch. And then you flip that end. I don't know how well this will do with me just having basted it. But see how that does? That keeps you from having to play with that end and get it folded in there and then get this folded down. If you go ahead and stitch that end and then flip the bias band over, then you'll have less trouble with those ends and you'll be ready to whip stitch your bias band down. Now, I'm going to take this little section of bias band off and show you another way to do this for those of you that don't have time for a lot of handwork. We have 13 grandchildren. 10 of them are girls, and 7 of them are still young enough that I sew for them. So I don't have a lot of time for handwork if it's something I can avoid. So we'll be back in just a second. Now, I'm going to show you another way to put your bias band on. Instead of putting your bias band right sides together, right side of the garment with the right side of the bias band, stitch it, flip it, whip it down. If you will put your bias band on the inside or the wrong side of the garment, you'll put the right side of the bias band onto the wrong side of the garment. Then I want you to stitch your 1/4 inch seam with the bias band up so that you can get a more accurate 1/4 inch seam. And then when you're finished, if you've got some areas where you need to maybe just clean up a little bit, maybe trim a little bit of the gathers from the ruffle off so that you can still have a 1/4 inch seam allowance that remains, do that. And then I went ahead and did this end the same way I showed you. So I'm ready to flip that back. And then this is the right side of the garment. And so I went through pinning, wrapping the bias band pretty tight around the seam allowance, which is what you want to do even the other way. This is what you would do if you were doing a bishop. If you will always wrap that bias tight, then your bias won't have a twisted look to it, which sometimes can happen. So I went through and pinned, and then what I did was I used a edge stitching foot, and this has a little guide here, and you just lay it down, put your fabric under the presser foot with that guide right up against that folded edge of the bias band, and then you'll need to move your needle position most likely, and how many times you move it varies from machine to machine. If you don't have an edge stitch foot, an open toe foot would work, something where you have good visibility so that you can do a consistent stitch right along there. And I know you can't see my stitches, but it really is a pretty neat look. Now, if this were a solid color garment, I probably wouldn't try this. But when it's a busy print, they're going to have to be awfully close to your child to see that. And it's just a kind of a time saver for me. So try it sometime. Practice on a scrap, and make sure that you're comfortable using an edge stitch foot and doing that technique. But I hope you try it sometime. Okay, now time for the hem. The Ginger dress, the hem requirement or the hem allowance is 3 inches. And so you start by turning up 1/4 of an inch, might be a little bit more, but 1/4 of an inch, and then fold it. The 3 inches should bring you right to the bottom of the ruffle. So you have the hem to put in, and then the lining to whip stitch down, and then buttons and buttonholes. I think it sounds like it's time to watch a movie and do some handwork. We'll see you back in a little while. Well, I hope you've enjoyed the class. We all enjoy seeing your creations, so keep them coming. This pattern, Ginger, is named after one of the original owners of the Children's Corner. So it's a very sweet pattern named after a very special lady. Hope to see you next time.